Welcome to Miss Marple Mystery. Tonight, in the quiet village of Mary Mead, a clock strikes 13 and one life ends. What secret hides behind the extra chime? Where are you listening from? Let us know in the comments. Under a sky bruised with the last traces of dusk, the village of Millards prepared itself for Christmas Eve. The vicar's hall glowed warmly with candlelight, where carols floated between the scent of pine, mulled wine, and roasting chestnuts. Miss Marple, seated near the window with her knitting, looked like part of the decor, gentle, harmless, quietly observant. Few noticed how often her eyes strayed not to the choir, but to the faces of those gathered. Mrs. Pembroke with her nervous glances toward the door, Colonel Avery, whose cheer was perhaps a shade too loud, and young Thomas Hale, his smile quick, yet his hands trembled each time the church clock chimed. The evening had an almost storybook perfection, the kind the village prided itself on until the clock struck 13. At first, the sound seemed impossible. The chime hung in the air, unnatural, discordant, sending a shiver through the assembly. Conversations froze mid-sentence, laughter died, and the choir faltered. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, from the direction of the vestry, came a sharp cry, a woman's voice, trembling with horror. By the time Miss Marple reached the small side room, half the village was pressing behind her. On the tiled floor, beneath the brass candlesticks and the shadow of the great oak crucifix, lay Henry Pembroke, the churchwarden, his spectacles shattered beside him. His expression one of quiet disbelief, as though death had caught him unawares. A faint bruise marked his temple, and the spilled ink from the register pooled like black blood near his hand. "Dear me," murmured Miss Marple softly. At Christmas, too. The vicar, pale and shaking, crossed himself. He must have slipped surely. Look at the ink pot. It's overturned. But Miss Marple's gaze had already moved past him. The overturned pot was too far from where the body lay. The bruise was on the wrong side for a fall. And the church clock, why had it struck 13? Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing the square in silence. Inside, that silence deepened, as though the village itself held its breath. Within the hour, Inspector Cray arrived from the next town, stamping frost from his boots. Already certain this was a tragic accident, but the villagers had other ideas. Mrs. Pembroke's tears were too loud. Colonel Avery's insistence that Henry had been perfectly well yesterday was repeated too often. Young Thomas Hale slipped away before anyone noticed, and the clock, that stubborn clock, still loomed in everyone's mind, its chime lingering like a curse. Miss Marple remained near the hearth, her knitting needles moving rhythmically, though her mind was far from wool and yarn. She had lived long enough to know that accidents in peaceful villages rarely came without stories beneath them. And tonight, in the shadow of the vicar's hall, a story had begun, one stitched not with goodwill or cheer, but with silence, envy, and something far darker. Outside, the clock struck again, only 12 this time. As if it regretted its earlier confession. The morning after Colonel Fawcett's death, Mary Mead was alive with whispers. The village had always thrived on small talk, who was visiting whom, who'd quarreled at the church bazaar, but now the gossip carried a tremor of fear. The colonel, after all, had been as much a fixture of the place as the church spire or the grocer's clock. His sudden death murder, some whispered, shattered the calm like a pebble dropped into still water. At the post office, Mrs. Bartlett was already recounting the news with relish to anyone who'd listen. "Locked room," they say. Can you imagine? And poor Mrs. Finch found him herself. Bless her heart. "George, didn't I? There was something queer about that clock last night. 13 chimes. I told him it was an omen." She lowered her voice. "And that niece of his, Lydia, oh, she looked pale as parchment when the clock struck. There's something in that, mark my words." Reverend Harcourt, passing by, frowned at the speculation. "Now, Mrs. Bartlett, we mustn't jump to conclusions. The police will see to it properly." But Mrs. Bartlett sniffed. "The police! They never understand these things. Mark me, Vicar, it'll come down to a woman's heart or a man's temper." Miss Marple, who had stopped in quietly to buy a few stamps, smiled faintly as she listened. She had long since learned that gossip, when sifted carefully, often held tiny fragments of truth like gold dust caught in the silt. Outside, the air was crisp and still. Miss Marple walked toward the vicarage, her thoughts knitting together as neatly as the scarf she'd left unfinished on her chair. Colonel Fawcett had been alive when she left his house, perhaps 10 minutes past 10. Dr. Price had fixed the time of death between 10:30 and midnight. The study door was locked from within. And yet, she paused, glancing toward the Fawcett house, its shutters now drawn tight. A constable stood outside, stamping his feet for warmth. Inside, no doubt, Inspector Craddock was sorting through evidence and interviewing the household. At that moment, Dr. Price emerged from the gate, his hat pulled low, his breath visible in the cold. He started slightly on seeing her. "Miss Marple, out early, I see. Dreadful business. Dreadful." The colonel was a fine man. "So sad," Miss Marple said softly. "Did you know him well?" "Oh, yes, well, as one does in a small place. He was robust, you know, never sick a day in his life. I'd hardly credit it if I hadn't seen him myself." The doctor hesitated. "A clean wound, directly to the heart. Odd thing, though no sign of struggle. No. Footprints, nothing disturbed. Almost as though the killer were invited," Miss Marple murmured. Dr. Price looked at her sharply. "You think someone he knew did it?" She smiled gently. "Oh, my dear doctor, in my experience, murder is very seldom the work of strangers." As the doctor departed, Miss Marple lingered at the gate, watching the frosted garden glisten in the pale sunlight. She noticed faint marks near the study window, perhaps where snow had melted unevenly. Not footprints, exactly, but impressions, too delicate for a man's shoe, perhaps the brushing of fabric. She tucked the observation quietly away in her mind. By afternoon, Inspector Craddock called at the vicarage, where Miss Marple was having tea with Mrs. Harcourt. "Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat, "I suppose you've heard half the village's theories by now." "Only half," she asked mildly. "Then I must be behind the times." He smiled despite himself. "There's little to go on. No forced entry. Locked from the inside. No signs of theft. We found a half-written letter on his desk, addressed to a solicitor in London. Something about changing his will. It ends rather abruptly." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly, stirring her tea. "Money again. It so often is." Craddock's expression darkened. "Lydia Fawcett stands to inherit most of it. But there's talk that her uncle was displeased with her lately. Something about debts. We'll be questioning her next. Poor child." Mrs. Harcourt sighed. She looked so pale at the party. "Yes," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "She did. Like someone who'd heard the clock strike 13 and realized time had caught up with her." Craddock gave her a curious look. "You and your clocks, Miss Marple. You make them sound like witnesses." "Perhaps they are," she replied quietly. "A clock tells us when things happen, but sometimes, Inspector, it also tells us why." That night, as darkness fell once more, Miss Marple sat by her window overlooking the snow-laden lane. Somewhere in the distance, the church clock struck 10 clean, steady, correct. Yet her mind returned again to the faint, unnatural 13th chime from the colonel's clock, and to the face of Lydia Fawcett when she'd heard it. There was something in that sound, a secret signal, perhaps, or a warning known only to one person in that room. And Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly, made a quiet promise to herself. She would find out who had been waiting for the clock to strike 13. Inspector Craddock returned to the Fawcett house before dusk. Miss Marple, under the pretext of bringing Mrs. Finch broth, followed with her knitting bag and a look of concern. The constable at the door let her pass. The corridors felt colder than the weather warranted. Mrs. Finch sat in the kitchen, hands around a cup she didn't drink, her apron crumpled. You mustn't neglect yourself, Miss Marple murmured, cooling a spoonful. Shock is an untidy visitor. Mrs. Finch nodded. He was particular about the clock, ma'am. Polished every Sunday, wound each night at 10. Never misbehaved. And last night, I wound it at 10. I was flustered with the pudding. It struck 13, and my heart went queer. She stared at the table. I think someone wanted that very noise. In my experience, Miss Marple said, performances rarely occur without rehearsal. Mrs. Finch looked up. There was a faint chime at 9:30. I was in the pantry. The case stood open, the pendulum still. I set it right. The Colonel said nothing. Miss Marple tucked that away and asked to see the study. The room was precise maps, a regiment photograph, ledgers aligned like soldiers. On the desk lay the unfinished letter and blotter. Snow light lay across the carpet. The open window had been latched by police. Beneath it, a walnut umbrella stand glistened where frost had dripped. Craddock entered, frowning. I can hardly have you rummaging, Miss Marple. I shouldn't dream of it, she said, regarding the rug's pile without touching. Often the simplest things tell us what clever ones hide. Nothing on the carpet, he said. No footprints. Door locked, key inside, window catch intact. There are locks that keep out the wrong person, she answered, and locks that keep in the right one. He produced a small envelope. We found this on the sill, glittering threads, metallic. Some trimmings fray where nerves do, Miss Marple murmured. Did Miss Lydia wear anything that would shed? Silver scarf, Craddock admitted. She says she left early, went straight home. Mrs. Finch saw her in the hall at 11:15. Hall clocks can be trusted, Miss Marple said. People less so. Doctor. Price appeared, summoned for a second look. Wound is precise. Letter opener heavy, sharpened. The assailant stood close, closer than a stranger. Then the Colonel admitted them. Miss Marple said, or never imagined danger. Craddock grunted. Family and household, then. Miss Lydia, Mrs. Finch, perhaps the vicar. The vicar left at 10, Miss Marple replied. Blessings rarely stab. Before leaving, she paused at the grandfather clock. Cherry wood gleamed. She noticed a speck of candle grease above the dial, and lower, the tiniest scratch near the hinge. She said nothing, only listened to the pendulum. That evening, she called at Lydia's lodgings over the dressmaker's. The young woman opened with a nervous start, the silver scarf flung on a chair. Miss Marple, have they arrested anyone? No, my dear. Lydia clasped her hands. He was changing his will. He'd threatened before, but last week he meant it. He said I'd learn responsibility the hard way. Her mouth trembled and steadied. I didn't kill him. I should like to believe you, Miss Marple said. Truth makes friends with small consistencies. Tell me, why did the clock upset you? Lydia flushed. Because 13 meant stay. When I was a child, Uncle joked that 13 was the thief's hour. It became our signal when he wished me to remain after guests. Last night, I promised I wouldn't, but I heard it and thought he wants me. And did you? I hesitated in the hall, then fled. I reached my room before 11. Who else knew the signal? No one. It was our foolish thing. Miss Marple rose. Thank you, my dear. There's comfort in learning which strings are still tied. One sees who can pluck them. On the way home, snow creaked underfoot. Windows shone. Miss Marple arranged her thoughts. A rehearsal chime, a private signal, a frayed thread, a speck of grease, a door that locked the wrong truth. Somewhere, a tidy person had staged an untidy act and trusted the hour to lie. Tomorrow, she would ask for candles and for polishing cloths. The next morning brought a grey mist that softened the edges of Mary Mead, as if the village itself wished to blur away from scandal. Miss Marple, however, awoke early. She took her tea by the window and thought about clocks and candles, about threads that glittered like secrets, and about people who believed they could arrange time and truth to their liking. By 8:30, she was out with her basket, heading toward the Fawcett house once again, her expression mild, but her mind alert. Inspector Craddock was already there, standing near the gate with a cigarette, looking none too pleased. "Back again, Miss Marple?" he said. "You don't rest, do you?" "One doesn't rest," she replied gently, "when something continues to tick that shouldn't." He frowned, but gestured her inside. "You might as well. Finch is in hysterics again. Says she's remembered something new." Mrs. Finch stood in the hall, wringing her hands. "Oh, Miss Marple, I can't abide it. I was dusting the sideboard this morning when I saw the Colonel's gloves still there. He always took them into the study, always, but last night they were on the stand." "I suppose that means nothing, does it?" "It means something," Miss Marple said quietly. "Everything does, if one looks closely enough." She turned to Craddock. "And where is Miss Fawcett this morning?" "Gone to London, she says, on business with her solicitor. Left before dawn. I've sent word to intercept her." "How very prompt," Miss Marple murmured. "It's curious, isn't it? Running away from questions tends to suggest that one knows the answers." Craddock gave a low grunt. "I'll admit it doesn't look good. She's got motive, the means, and that peculiar signal of hers. Still, I can't make out how she did it." The door was locked. Miss Marple nodded. "A door can be locked with intent or by accident. But what if the lock were only part of the theatre? A clever trick to make us think no one left the room at all." Craddock looked unconvinced, but Miss Marple had already crossed to the grandfather clock. She ran a gloved finger lightly along the hinge again. "I should like to see inside this case, Inspector." "May I?" He hesitated, then nodded. She opened the wooden panel carefully. The pendulum swayed gently, ticking like a patient heart. But there, wedged between the brass weights, was a small candle stub, its wax hardened and speckled with soot. "Well," Craddock said, astonished. "What on earth?" "It's quite simple," Miss Marple said softly. "Someone lit this candle, placed it here, and left the case open so the heat would interfere with the mechanism. The candle would burn down, melt a thread, or perhaps shift the gear, making the clock strike at the wrong time. 13 instead of 12. A mechanical deceit, timed to perfection." Craddock's eyes widened. "You mean someone used the clock to create an alibi?" "Or a signal," Miss Marple corrected. "The chime at 13 told one person it was safe or necessary to act." She closed the panel gently. "But it wasn't Lydia who lit this candle, Inspector. She was too frightened of her uncle to meddle with his clock. This speaks of someone who knew his routines, who could move freely through the house unnoticed." Mrs. Finch, still standing nearby, gave a faint whimper. Miss Marple turned to her kindly. "You've served him many years, haven't you? You must have known every sound this house made." The housekeeper nodded shakily. "I did. I even heard the clock that night, striking wrong, but I thought it meant something bad, like death was passing by the window." "Not passing, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, "stopping in." That evening, Miss Marple sat once again by her fire, the clock on her mantel ticking with innocent regularity. She recalled Mrs. Finch's trembling hands, the doctor's unease, Lydia's frightened eyes. Each piece of the puzzle lay before her, though not yet arranged. The candle in the clock had been the stagehand's trick timing, sound, illusion. But someone had to have placed it there at precisely the right moment, before the guests left. Someone calm enough to feign confusion when it chimed 13. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she remembered Dr. Price's words at the gate, the way he had said no footprints, nothing disturbed. A physician who notices absences, not presences. A man who could declare a wound's precision and ensure it. Miss Marple reached for her knitting, the wool sliding softly through her fingers. Patterns always told her the truth if she followed the threads carefully, and this pattern, so deliberate, so neat, had begun to reveal its weaver. Tomorrow, she thought, she would pay Dr. Price a friendly visit. Not to ask questions, of course, but simply to return a borrowed medical book She had never borrowed at all. The following afternoon was damp and heavy, the kind of weather that made even the cheerful cottages of Mary Mead seem subdued. Miss Marple, however, was undeterred. She walked slowly toward Dr. Price's surgery, her umbrella tapping softly on the pavement. The little brass plate on the gate gleamed dully through the mist. Dr. Leonard Price, physician and surgeon. Inside, the curtains were drawn, though a thin line of lamplight escaped at the edges. She knocked lightly. "Come in," called his voice, brisk yet weary. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and tobacco. Papers lay scattered across the desk, and a half-empty cup of tea had gone cold beside the stethoscope. "Doctor," Price looked up from his notes, managing a polite smile. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect you. No one ever does," she said pleasantly, closing her umbrella. "I was returning your medical book. You lent it to me some time ago, I think about fainting spells in elderly patients." He blinked. "Did I? Well, I'm sure you found it interesting." "Oh, most enlightening," she said mildly, placing a slim volume on the desk. "Though I confess, I found the chapter on syringes and sedatives rather alarming. One never realizes how easily a person could be rendered helpless if someone were inclined." The doctor's expression stiffened just slightly. "We deal with delicate instruments, Miss Marple, best left to trained hands." "Indeed. You must have a steady hand, Doctor. You mentioned the Colonel's wound was quite precise." He frowned. "So it was. Straight to the heart." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes gentle. "One imagines that would require calmness and proximity." There was a pause, faintly stretched. Outside, the wind rattled the branches. Dr. Price cleared his throat. "Inspector Craddock believes Miss Fawcett is responsible. She's been found, by the way. Stopped at reading station. They'll bring her in this evening." "How efficient," Miss Marple said. "Though efficiency can sometimes miss the finer threads of truth." She glanced at the doctor's desk. A small velvet case lay open beside the papers, containing several hypodermic needles. "Such slender things," she murmured, "like weapons pretending to be helpful." "Doctor," Price gave a short laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You do have a grim imagination, Miss Marple. These are harmless tools of healing." "Tools, yes," she said softly, "though tools in the wrong hands can serve other purposes." She rose slowly, adjusting her gloves. "I mustn't keep you, Doctor. Thank you for indulging an old woman's curiosity." When she left, his polite smile faded almost at once. He locked the surgery door behind her. For a moment, he stood quite still, staring at the faint smear of candle wax that clung to his cuff unnoticed until now. Then, he rubbed it away with a handkerchief and poured himself a measure of brandy. Miss Marple walked home through the drizzle, her steps unhurried. She had seen it, the brief flicker of fear in his eyes, the guilty habit of tidiness that betrayed anxiety. She knew the look too well. It was the look of a man whose control had begun to slip. That evening, Inspector Craddock stopped by her cottage. "Miss Marple, you'll want to know we've brought Miss Fawcett back. Poor girl was nearly hysterical. Says she only fled because she couldn't bear the suspicion. And what does she say of the night itself? She swears she never went near the study after 10. But there's something odd, Doctor. Price insists she was calmer than that when he saw her. He claims she even asked him for a sleeping draught before leaving the party. We found no such bottle in her room. Perhaps," Miss Marple said gently, "because it was never meant for her." Craddock stared. "You think Price?" She didn't answer at once. Instead, she looked toward the mantel clock. It's ticking steady as a heartbeat. "You see, Inspector, some men find power in silence. They learn how to mimic concern, how to use precision not only in surgery but in deceit. And sometimes," she said softly, "a candle flame burns just long enough to mask what happens in the dark." He exhaled slowly. "We've no proof of that." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "Not yet." But I think if you search the Colonel's medical cabinet, you might find a small, empty vial, something that shouldn't have been there, something only a doctor would recognize as missing. Look for that, and you'll find your truth." When Craddock left, Miss Marple sat alone for a while, listening to the distant murmur of rain against glass. She thought of Dr. Price's calm hands, of Lydia's frightened eyes, of Mrs. Finch polishing silver to hide her trembling. The pieces were fitting themselves quietly together, one stitch at a time. Soon the pattern would be complete. "People," she murmured, pouring another cup of tea, "are so dreadfully predictable. But time keeps its own counsel." Night fell softly over Mary Mead, and the rain became a fine mist that turned the lamplight into halos. Miss Marple sat near her fire, knitting untouched in her lap. Her thoughts were far from wool and needles. The pattern she was following now was not of yarn but of human weakness, threads of fear, greed, and guilt, weaving quietly into a noose. She had seen it before, many times, and it always began with small lies meant to protect larger ones. A knock sounded at her door, urgent, uneven. She opened it to find Inspector Craddock, his coat soaked through, his face drawn. "May I come in, Miss Marple? I'm afraid the case has taken a turn." "Of course, Inspector," she said calmly, ushering him to the hearth. "You look as though you've been chasing ghosts." He accepted the offered tea but didn't drink. "We searched the Colonel's cabinet, as you suggested. There was apices, an empty, vile morphine solution. The label was removed, but the residue matched his prescriptions. And there's more. Dr. Price is missing." "Missing?" Her tone remained mild, though her eyes sharpened. "Gone since noon. His housekeeper thought he'd gone to the coroner's office. Never arrived. His car's still at the surgery. We've sent word to nearby stations." Craddock rubbed his temple. He left a note, nothing clear. Just said, "A clock cannot be wound backward," whatever that means. Miss Marple looked into the fire for a long moment. Perhaps he meant that guilt, once begun, cannot be undone, though men often try. Craddock leaned forward. "You think he did it, don't you?" She hesitated only briefly. "I think Dr. Price loved precision more than people. And when such a man feels his control slipping, he's capable of dreadful things. The Colonel discovered something perhaps that his trusted physician had been writing false prescriptions, perhaps stealing small doses over time. He meant to change his will and confront him. The doctor came that night expecting to reason with him, but reason failed." Craddock frowned. "And the locked door?" "The Colonel trusted him enough to let him in. The wound was made quickly, perhaps after a mild sedative. Then came the cleverness, the candle in the clock, the false 13th chime, to suggest the Colonel was still alive later than he was. It gave Dr. Price his alibi." "But why now?" Craddock asked quietly. "Because Colonel Fawcett was about to expose him. Lydia's debts made her the perfect distraction everyone would suspect her first. He counted on it." Before Craddock could reply, a sharp rap interrupted them. Constable Jenkins stood in the doorway, rain dripping from his helmet. "Sir, word from the mill road. There's been a crash. A bicycle belonging to Dr. Price. They've found him." Craddock rose instantly. "Alive?" "Barely, sir. Took a fall near the old bridge. Looks like he swerved on purpose." Miss Marple stood too, her face unreadable. Poor man. Even in death, one hopes for a confession, though men rarely speak truthfully when they've lived by lies. At dawn, the news spread. Dr. Price had succumbed to his injuries before morning. In his pocket was a folded paper, damp but legible. It read simply, "I only meant to quiet him." The heart stopped too soon. The clock was my undoing. By mid-morning, Inspector Craddock returned to Miss Marple's cottage. "It's finished," he said tiredly. He confessed, "Just as you said. It was the morphine intended to paralyze, not kill." When the Colonel collapsed, Price panicked. He locked the door to delay discovery, set the candle in the clock, and slipped out through the window before it froze shut. Miss Marple poured him tea, her hands steady. How foolishly human to think one can control time itself. But the clock always tells on those who tamper with it. Craddock sighed. The niece is cleared. She's leaving for London tonight. Says she can't bear to stay. Quite understandable, Miss Marple said softly. This village will remember too much. She glanced toward the mantel clock, which ticked faithfully, each second a reminder of truth's persistence. You see, Inspector, evil often hides behind order, behind polished brass and punctual habits. One must listen, not just to what people say, but to what time itself reveals. He nodded, rising to go. I'll remember that, Miss Marple. You've been a great help as always. When the door closed behind him, she sat alone once more. The rain had stopped, and the first pale light of morning spread across the lane. She picked up her knitting again, the soft click of needles filling the quiet room. Outside, the church clock struck 11 clean, perfect, and true. For the first time in days, Mary Mead was silent when it should be, and Miss Marple smiled faintly. The clock had struck 13 only once, but that was enough to reveal every secret hidden in the night. 2 days passed since Dr. Price's death, and though the official case was closed, the atmosphere in Mary Mead remained thick with unease. Villagers spoke in lowered tones at the post office, as though the ghost of the colonel might still be listening. But Miss Marple, sitting quietly by her lace-curtained window, felt the pattern was not yet finished. It was neat, too neat, the confession, the accident, the timing, it all fit a little too perfectly, and in Miss Marple's long experience, perfection was rarely genuine. She stirred her tea thoughtfully, her gaze drifting to the mantel clock. Its ticking was calm now, innocent even, but she could not shake the faint sense that something had been left unsaid. Dr. Price's letter had been brief, almost polished in its remorse, lacking the disorder of true panic. She had seen confessions before real ones trembled with humanity. His read like a man tidying up his reputation, not baring his soul. That afternoon, Lydia Fawcett came to see her. She looked pale and drawn. The lines of fear softened into a kind of weary resignation. "I wanted to thank you, Miss Marple," she said quietly. "The inspector told me what you discovered. Without you, I might have been tried for something I didn't do." "My dear, I'm very glad justice was done," Miss Marple replied, motioning her to sit. "But tell me, what will you do now?" "I've decided to sell the house," Lydia said, her voice tight. "There are too many memories there. My uncle's solicitor is arranging the papers. He said the will is still valid. Dr. Price never witnessed the change. It means I inherit everything." She hesitated, looking ashamed. "It feels wrong somehow. After all that's happened." "Guilt has a way of confusing gratitude," Miss Marple murmured. "But I wouldn't be too hasty about leaving, my dear. Sometimes it's better to understand what truly happened before turning one's back on it." Lydia frowned slightly. "You think there's more?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that truth often has one layer more than we expect." That evening, Miss Marple took a slow walk through the lane toward the Fawcett house. The police had removed their barriers. The windows stood dark except for a single light in the study. She'd asked Mrs. Finch to meet her there, under the pretext of collecting a forgotten shawl. The housekeeper arrived promptly, her hands twisting her handkerchief. "I don't like coming here after dark, Miss Marple. Gives me the shivers." "It does. Courage, my dear," Miss Marple said softly, opening the study door. "Let's see if ghosts are as untidy as men." The room looked exactly as before, the desk neatly arranged, the clock silent in the corner. Miss Marple's eyes went to the floor, where the rug showed faint signs of movement, its fringe slightly misaligned. She bent down, lifting the edge gently. Beneath it, she found a small brass button, dull with age. Mrs. Finch gasped. "That's not from the Colonel's things. I know every stitch he owned." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but I believe I've seen it before on the cuff of a certain gentleman's coat." "Dr. Price?" "Not Doctor. Price, Miss Marple said quietly. Inspector Craddock. Mrs. Finch blinked, stunned. You can't mean not murder, Miss Marple interrupted calmly. But interference. Yes, the confession was too convenient, too complete. Someone helped him write it, or rather, someone wrote it for him. You see, Craddock arrived at the cottage before Price's death was confirmed, claiming he'd come from the coroner. But the coroner later told me he hadn't seen him until the next morning. Mrs. Finch clutched her apron. Then he knew. He suspected, Miss Marple said, and feared the embarrassment of another unsolved scandal under his watch. When Price fled, Craddock followed. I believe the doctor's accident was real enough, but his confession wasn't his own. The inspector needed the matter closed neatly, and so he arranged for it. She straightened slowly, replacing the rug as it was. Ambition is a dangerous motive, Mrs. Finch. It drives men to tidy away the truth, just as others sweep dust beneath carpets. But dust has a habit of returning in the light. Later, back in her cottage, Miss Marple sat before her fire once more, reflecting on what must be done. Craddock was not a cruel man, only vain, desperate to preserve his reputation. Still, justice required honesty. Tomorrow, she would write a letter to his superiors, carefully worded, without malice, but with precision. The church clock struck 9, clear and resonant through the quiet night. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Ah, she murmured. Back to 12 again. Let us hope it stays that way. Outside, the snow began to fall once more, soft and patient, covering the sins of Mary Mead in a blanket of white for now. The following morning dawned bright and cold, sunlight scattering over frost-tipped hedges and making the roofs of Mary Mead sparkle as though nothing dark had ever passed beneath them. But beneath the surface calm, Miss Marple knew, guilt still lingered like fog trapped in the hollows. She rose earlier than usual, set her kettle to boil, and laid out her stationery neatly. There was one more thing to be done, and she preferred such matters handled before breakfast. Her letter to the chief superintendent would be brief, courteous, and utterly precise, just enough to invite a second glance at Inspector Craddock's report without quite accusing him of deceit. She had written only the first paragraph when there came a firm knock on the door. When she opened it, there stood Inspector Craddock himself, his hat in hand, his expression tight. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, though his tone carried no warmth. "Might I come in? There are certain matters I'd like to clarify." "Of course," she replied evenly, motioning him toward the hearth. "You find me in a most domestic mood, Inspector. I was just preparing a letter." "So I see." His gaze flicked briefly toward the writing desk, where the half-finished sheet lay open. He said nothing, but the corner of his mouth twitched almost imperceptibly. "You've been asking questions again, haven't you?" "About me." She poured tea with calm precision. "I ask questions only where the answers seem incomplete. And in this case, I found Dr. Price's confession unusually tidy. I've known criminals who lied beautifully, Inspector, but not ones who died doing it." He accepted his cup, but didn't drink. "You're very shrewd, Miss Marple. Too shrewd, perhaps. But before you accuse me of tampering with evidence, you should understand that I did what was necessary. The village needed peace. The superintendent wanted the matter closed. Price was already dying. There was nothing to gain by dragging it through the mud." "Except your reputation," Miss Marple said softly. His jaw tightened. "You think I killed him?" "No," she said after a pause. "But I think you let him die without help, which in essence is much the same to a soul that understands right and wrong. You knew the truth, but you chose convenience." Craddock rose sharply, setting his teacup down with a clatter. "You're an extraordinary woman, Miss Marple, sharp as a tack and twice as dangerous. But the world doesn't run on your sense of morality. Sometimes a little concealment spares a great deal of pain." "Ah," she murmured, "but concealment is like mildew. It thrives in the dark, Inspector, until the whole structure rots from within." For a moment, They regarded one another, the air between them brittle as glass. Then Craddock sighed, his shoulders sinking. "You won't report me, will you?" Miss Marple folded her hands primly in her lap. "That rather depends on you. There's a difference between redemption and avoidance. If you truly regret what you did, I should think the first step is to make it right yourself." He said nothing, but his eyes troubled, uncertain, betrayed something like shame. At last, he picked up his hat. "You won't see me again for a while. I'll see to it that the file is amended properly. But for your own sake, leave it now. You've already peeled back more truth than most could bear." When he was gone, Miss Marple sat in the stillness for several minutes, listening to the faint tick of her clock. She did not weep, nor smile. There was no satisfaction in being right when rightness came so dearly bought. She tore the letter in half, then in quarters, feeding each piece to the fire until only ash remained. By afternoon, word reached the village that Inspector Craddock had tendered his resignation. The official reason was ill health, though tongues wagged in the post office about London interference and police politics. Miss Marple neither confirmed nor denied anything. She simply took her shopping basket and went about her errands, as though nothing in the world had altered. Yet, as she passed the Fawcett house, she saw movement through the window. Lydia Fawcett, standing in the study once again. The girl looked lost, staring at the old clock as though listening for ghosts. Miss Marple hesitated, then rapped lightly on the door. Lydia greeted her with a faint smile. "You must think me foolish, coming back here, but I couldn't bear to leave it unsettled. I keep hearing that dreadful chime in my mind, 13 strikes, over and over." "It's natural, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "Trauma lingers in curious ways, but the clock no longer lies." She crossed to the case, running a finger along its smooth frame. "May I?" Lydia nodded. Miss Marple opened the door and looked inside. The weights gleamed. The pendulum swung steadily. But in the far corner of the mechanism, something small caught her eye. A folded scrap of paper wedged deep behind the brass plate. She drew it out carefully. "What's that?" Lydia asked, startled. Miss Marple unfolded it slowly. The paper was brittle, the ink faint, but the handwriting unmistakable. "It's from your uncle," she said softly. A fragment of the will he was rewriting. Lydia leaned closer, her breath catching as she read aloud. "And should anything befall me, I wish it known that my niece is entirely innocent of my misfortunes. She has suffered enough through no fault of her own. My remaining estate is to be left in trust to—" The rest was torn away. Miss Marple met the girl's wide eyes. "You see, my dear, the Colonel must have realized his danger. He hid this here, perhaps intending to return for it. Dr. Price likely never saw it, or if he did, he couldn't afford to let it surface." Tears welled in Lydia's eyes. "Then Uncle did forgive me." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, replacing the note. "And perhaps, in his own way, he wished to forgive the others too." That evening, as dusk deepened and the first stars pricked the sky, Miss Marple walked home along the frost-hardened lane. The village was quiet again, properly quiet. Behind her, the church clock struck 8 clean, unwavering, perfectly measured. For the first time in days, the sound felt like peace, not accusation. At her cottage, she settled by the window and watched the snow begin to fall anew, thin as lace against the glass. She thought of the Colonel, of Dr. Price, of Lydia, and even of Inspector Craddock, each bound, in their own flawed way, by the ticking of the same clock. Human nature, she reflected, was not so different from time itself. It could be wounded, delayed, or disguised, but never truly stopped. Truth, like the pendulum, always swung back to its rightful place. She smiled faintly, poured herself a cup of tea, and whispered into the quiet room. 13 chimes, and now all is still again. Morning settled into a thin winter hush, the sort that made footsteps sound disloyal on the lane. Miss Marple, who believed silence was never empty but packed with echoes, took her shawl and walked toward the church. She had slept lightly, thinking of the fragment in the clock and of how oddly life will tuck truth into crevices, as though truth, too, were shy. Lydia's relief had been genuine. Miss Marple trusted that sort of trembling, but the fragment's torn edge had troubled her. It was jagged, fibrous, like paper wrenched in haste rather than neatly cut. Someone had removed the rest of the page long before Price's clumsy, final tidying. If that someone had meant harm, the fragment would not have remained. If they had meant nothing at all, they had merely taken scrap without a thought. In Mary Mead, thoughtlessness was often the more dangerous explanation. Inside the church, pale light fell in bars across the nave. Mrs. Prouse was at the organ, coaxing a timid, once in Royal David City, from pipes that preferred spring to winter. She started when she saw Miss Marple, then smiled with habitual apology. "Oh, Miss Marple, dear me, you've given me a turn. I was only practicing the descant. It always goes flat on the fourth bar, and the vicar says, well, he's very kind about it." "You play with feeling," Miss Marple said, climbing the few steps to the loft. "Feeling is sometimes wiser than accuracy, though accuracy has its uses." She let her gaze rest casual, unhurried on the pile of loose papers beside the stops. Some were choir lists, some hymn notes, some cuttings, and one something else. A page of good, heavy paper, with a ragged side that pulled at the eye. Mrs. Prouse flushed. "I do hope you won't think me wicked, but I've taken to collecting odd sheets from all, over scraps for lyrics and such. My memory is a sieve. If I don't write an entrance, I make one too soon." "May I?" Miss Marple asked, already lifting the page. The texture told her enough, but the nose remembers what fingers miss. The faintest ghost of sealing wax and the breath of old vellum. She set the fragment from the Colonel's clock against the ragged edge of the loft page. The torn fibers married with a soft, inevitable fit, like a healed bone. Paper recognized paper. Mrs. Prouse pressed both hands to her mouth. "Oh heavens! Oh heavens! I never, Miss Marple. I only needed something to copy the new verses for Epiphany. I came early to the Colonel's party. You see, to ask if I might borrow a book from his library, the old Carol collection. Mrs. Finch let me wait in the hall. The study door was ajar. There were sheets on the desk and I was in a flutter. I tore one loose corner. I didn't think it would matter. How could I think it would matter? Because we are human," Miss Marple said gently. "And we rarely think beyond the minute we are in." She laid the pieces flat on the railing, her eyes softening. "You did not know what you were taking. The Colonel meant to set his will to rights. You merely mended a gap in your memory." She looked across the nave to the blank, patient altar. He hid what was left, where only a careful hand would find it. Perhaps even he feared that, by morning, the rest would be lost. Mrs. Prouse swayed on the bench, as if a chord had gone sour inside her. "What shall I do?" "You shall return it," Miss Marple answered, "in the presence of the vicar and the solicitor. You shall say exactly what you have said now. Folly is not malice." She paused. "Did you ever speak to Dr. Price about the Colonel's clock?" "Dr. Price?" A furrow appeared between Mrs. Prouse's brows. Well, yes. At the fête, in September. We were setting up the trestles by the schoolhouse, and Lydia laughed about 13 o'clock, a private joke of hers and the Colonel's. I scolded her, said 13 was unlucky. Dr. Price was there. He smiled in that dry way of his and said, "Unlucky for whom?" I didn't think anything of it. "Very few do," Miss Marple murmured. "That is why such men flourish." By noon, Reverend Harcourt sat in the study at the Fawcett House, spectacles low on his nose, while Mr. Pemberton, the London solicitor, examined the rejoined page with a small grunt of satisfaction. Lydia stood behind them, pale but composed. Mrs. Finch with her hands clenched in her apron and her lips moving soundlessly through prayers that had not yet been written. Miss Marple, unobtrusive as a standard lamp, watched the men read. watched their eyes. Pemberton cleared his throat. This is unequivocally the Colonel's hand. The trust is clear. A third to settle outstanding care for veterans of his regiment. A third to establish a small scholarship for village children. And a third placed in annuity for Mrs. Finch. Here, the housekeeper's breath caught like a snagged thread, with Lydia Fawcett appointed trustee over all disbursements and sole heir in fee to the house and its contents. Lydia's shoulders trembled, then straightened. So he trusted me after all. He meant you to learn stewardship, not punishment, Miss Marple said. Those are not the same. Mrs. Finch sobbed once, a fragile, grateful sound, and clutched her apron as if it might save her from sinking. Reverend Harcourt removed his spectacles and polished them with the sort of care one gives to grief. This is justice, he said softly. And mercy. Pemberton signed and dated, his pen a crisp little metronome on the page. We'll file this at once. I regret the delay. Had I arrived sooner. Time does not always honor trains, Miss Marple said, and the solicitor smiled in spite of himself. Business concluded, the room emptied gently, as if the house itself exhaled after long restraint. Lydia lingered. So did Miss Marple. Snowlight feathered the study carpet, and the old clock, properly set now, offered a patient tick as steady as a calm heart. Lydia touched the case. I hated it, you know. After the 13th strike, I thought it had called death, but perhaps it called truth. Truth was already knocking, Miss Marple said. The clock merely persuaded someone to open the door. Lydia looked at her. What happens now? Now, Miss Marple said, drawing on her gloves, you do precisely what your uncle intended. You keep faith. You mend small things. You remember that order without kindness breeds cruelties of its own, and kindness without order is only drift. She paused. And you forgive if you can. For Dr. Price? Lydia asked, almost incredulous. For your uncle, and for yourself. When Miss Marple stepped back into the lane, the village air felt clean again, like linen dried in January sun. She walked home unhurriedly, past hedges bristling with frost and cottage windows bright with ordinary life. The case, such as it was, had become what all cases become when their edges soften. A story people would tell each other, flurried and inaccurate, in which the clock struck 13, the doctor fell from a bridge, and an old woman happened to be listening when time confessed. She smiled. The church clock struck the hour 12 perfect, sufficient notes, and the world, for once, kept time. The thaw came slyly overnight, loosening the white crust at the verges and setting the gutters murmuring. By late morning, Mary Mead glistened with wet. Icicles snapped like small decisions. Miss Marple, who liked a village best when it was returning to its chores, watched the milkman clank his way down the lane and thought about endings. They were never as tidy as people wanted. Even when the chief actor had left the stage, poor misguided Dr. Price there. Remained the scenery to be struck, the last props to be accounted for, and the audience to be ushered gently toward the door with a sense that the play had told the truth. At the vicarage that day, there was to be a small meeting, purely practical, Reverend Harcourt had said in his letter concerning the Colonel's new provisions for the village. Lydia would attend. Mr. Pemberton would outline the trust. Mrs. Finch had promised to bring her little blue notebook with the names of old soldiers and their dependents. We shall set a good example, the vicar had added, by doing good briskly. Miss Marple approved. Brisk goodness was as curative as broth. She arrived a little before noon and found the drawing-room warm with steam and promised tea. The vicar stood by the fire, spectacles pushed up, papers in his hand. Lydia sat near the window with a composed face that had learned in a week to carry responsibility. Mr. Pemberton, precise as his pen, nodded politely. Mrs. Finch hovered by the door, her notebook clutched like a lifebuoy. Excellent, the vicar said, rubbing his hands. We'll begin with the scholarship, Miss Marple. I thought you might advise us on quiet families in need of loud help. You always do know the quiet ones. One must, if one wishes to hear them, she replied, taking a seat. Pemberton cleared his throat. The Colonel's intentions are plain. We'll open the veteran's ledger first. He set the file upon the table. Names, dates, allotments. Mrs. Finch, your notebook may be the key here. The housekeeper came forward, breathing faster. Her fingers, red from soap and winter, trembled at the string that tied the covers. She loosened it. A scrap of paper fell, fluttering to the carpet. Miss Marple recognized the Colonel's hand at once, small and upright, each letter a soldier. Mrs. Finch stooped, flustered, and Miss Marple was already bending, unobtrusive, to help. The scrap was not a letter, only a list of 4 initials with sums beside them. His private reminders, Mrs. Finch said, cheeks pink. I meant to include it. He was always counting on his fingers and then tucking the answers here, in case his head forgot. Men of order make allowances for the heart, Miss Marple said, handing it up. Business went forward sensibly. Sums were agreed, trusteeship recorded, and at last Reverend Harcourt put his papers aside with the air of a man who has steered a skiff from eddy into current. Lydia exhaled. Thank you, she said into the comfortable hush. It's strange how giving away money can feel like receiving it. It is a form of receiving, Miss Marple said. One's own purpose, for a start. She rose, smoothing her skirt. If I may, there is a tiny matter I should like to put straight while we are all here. 4 faces turned toward her. Even the vicar's old clock seemed to listen. Miss Marple's tone was mild, conversational, the tone in which women exchange cake recipes and the fate of nations. I have wondered, she said, about the rehearsal. They stared blankly, then recollection moved like a ripple. Mrs. Finch made a small sound. On the night of the party, Miss Marple continued gently, you heard a faint chime at 9:30. The clock case stood open. The pendulum had been stilled. It troubled you, and you set it going again. That tells us 2 things. That someone interfered earlier than the 13th stroke, and that the person counted on your loyalty to routine. But a person who planned the candle so thoughtfully would not risk discovery by leaving the case agape unless he were interrupted or unless he wished to see whether the house noticed. Pemberton frowned. But Dr. Price? Yes, Miss Marple agreed. Dr. Price lit the candle and arranged the trick. Yet the rehearsal so small, so telling was not his style. He preferred certainty. A rehearsal is for a nervous hand, one that needs to feel the hinge and hear the whisper of the latch. Her eyes, kindly still, turned to Mrs. Finch. You have been brave, my dear, and I think you can be braver. You opened the clock before 9:30 to see how it worked. Not to harm anyone, only because you had been told that clocks can be made to speak when one wishes. Someone told you that the Colonel often signaled his niece by a 13th chime. You were afraid that he meant to send her away for good in the will, and you wished quite simply to keep your family as it had always been. Silence lay down in the room like snow. Mrs. Finch's hand crept to the chair back and held fast. I only looked, she whispered. Only looked. I couldn't bear the thought of Miss Lydia gone, the house empty of her laughter. He'd been so hard with her of late. I only wanted to see if it could be done. If one might I don't know, nudge time. She pressed her palms together, the skin blanching. But I never lit any candle. I would never. No, Miss Marple said, very softly. You did not. You touched the hinge, heard the tiny proud squeak of a well-kept door, and shut it again in a fright. That was your rehearsal and your repentance all at once. It is important that we name things correctly, or else guilt grows in the wrong soil. She turned to Lydia. Your housekeeper loves you in the manner of those who dust the frames and remember the child in the portrait. Her love is humble and not very logical. It made her foolish for an instant and faithful for a lifetime. Lydia's face had gone very still. Then it loosened into something warmer than tears. She crossed the rug, took Mrs. Finch's hands, and held them without speech. The housekeeper's shoulders shook once, twice, then steadied under the grasp of absolution. Reverend Harcourt cleared his throat. "We are all of us prone to small mischiefs that seem like kindness when we are frightened," he said, his voice unsteady and kind. "Let us be grateful that this one ended where it began, in fear of doing wrong." Mr. Pemberton fastidiously capped his pen and looked away, which for a legal man was mercy enough. When Miss Marple left the vicarage, the thaw had gone past rhetoric. Water chimed under the hedge where ice had been. She walked without haste, content at last that the pattern had no hidden knots. Dr. Price had done the wicked act. Inspector Craddock had done the cowardly one. Mrs. Prouse had done the foolish one. Mrs. Finch had almost done a foolishness and stopped herself. Lydia, of all of them, had been blamed first and forgiven last, as young women so often are. And the Colonel, stern, orderly, essentially decent, had managed from beyond the veil to place his house in the hands of mercy. At her gate, Miss Marple paused to remove a dead leaf from the privet. It clung obstinately. She coaxed it free, smiling at the leaf's refusal to understand that its time had passed. Inside, she laid her hat on its peg and set the kettle on. The clock on her mantel was exact to the minute. She had seen to it before leaving. When it struck the hour, it did so precisely 12 times, each note unhurried, none intruding upon the next. She poured her tea and allowed herself the smallest indulgence of relief. Somewhere deep in the house, the pipes clucked and settled. Outside, a child laughed at the pleasure of splashing. Miss Marple thought of the Colonel's list with its careful initials, of Lydia's new steadiness, of Mrs. Finch's blue notebook with its string that came untied at last. She thought, too, of time and how people fancy they can persuade it to behave, to halt at a chime, to skip an awkward beat, to look away while a hand trembles. Time does not look away, but it forgives, in its fashion, by moving on. She lifted her cup. "Well then," she said into the ordinary room, "back to 12.